Oh, that's divine. That's absolutely divine, Geary. Absolutely brilliant. That is, that is the best poem on what it's like to be going through puberty at the age of 14 in the style of Rudyard Kipling I think I've heard today. Absolutely superb. Absolutely superb, boy. Brilliant. A masterpiece. You truly are a master. I think there's no question about it. I'm going to have to give you a prize. I'm going to have to give you a prize for that, boy. And that prize will be this book on the history of Anglo-Saxon England, which I'm sure you're going to enjoy. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about it. Now, God, superb. Oh, sublime. Now, Master Hopkins, let's hear your poem. What do you mean? What do you mean you haven't written it? Why not, boy? Well, what kind of excuse is that? What kind of excuse is that? Everybody else has managed to write it. Oh, for goodness sake, don't be ridiculous. I want to see that poem on my desk by 5 o'clock this evening. And if it's not that, if I haven't got a poem on my desk about what it's like going through a puberty at the age of 14 in the style of Rudyard Kipling, I'm going to give you a damn good thrashing! Don't you look at me like that, boy. You know how it works in my class. If you're good, you get a reward, and we're friends, and I have a fantastic time, and we go on fantastic trips, we do all kinds of fantastic stuff. But if you cross the line, you know how it works, you get a good tongue lashing, and you get your ass kicked. Bailey, what are you laughing at, boy? What are you doing? Well, give it back to him, then. What do you mean he's moving, jumping around? I catch you jumping around. You'll be wanting to jump around when I finish with you, boy. You'll be jumping around all night. Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Jolly Heretic. Now, that was an impression of my secondary school English teacher, Dr. Harvey, and I think it was quite a reasonable one, really. It's exactly what he was like, and in many ways he was our favourite teacher. And it brings me into what I wanted to talk about today, which is the issue of ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Now, there's more and more of this ADHD these days. Everybody seems to be suffering from ADHD. In fact, the other day, my son said to me that he wants to have our day, ho day, which is the Finnish translation of ADHD. I couldn't understand why he would want to have it, and it turns out it's so popular in his class that he feels left out by virtue of the fact that he's relatively mentally normal. So, what is this thing ADHD? Well, it's defined by the American Psychological Association as something like the constant search for stimulation, restlessness, sensation-seeking behaviour, fidgeting, difficulty maintaining attention, the inability to concentrate on anything that requires sustained effort. And as a very interesting author called Sandy Mann has pointed out in a book called The Science of Boredom, this definition of ADHD sounds remarkably similar to how one might define basically feeling bored. And what Mann argues is that really that there isn't some genetic rise in lots and lots of people having some disorder, ADHD, in the same way that it might be argued that there is a rise in autism for genetic reasons, as demonstrated by the fact that autism is associated with paternal age, which seems to mean that it's associated with mutant sperm and is therefore associated with people having children older, for example. It's something to do with the environment. And what he asked, what this author asks is it caused by a culture of novelty? And the idea is, and I think you can see this again and again and again, is that in the modern world we are overstimulated. We are becoming, and this means that we are more and more intolerant of anything that is slow. We are less and less able to concentrate. We are less and less able to sit there and ponder and just contemplate and just basically be bored than used to be the case. And this seems to me to be manifestly true. If you watch comedies from the 1970s, British comedies, when they're setting it up in the first series, in the first episode of the comedy, you'll find there's quite a substantial period of time as they're setting it up and allowing you to get to know the characters. The Good Life is an example of this, where there really aren't that many jokes. And this simply wouldn't be tolerated anymore. We would turn off. Our attention span is too limited. If we're not immediately interested in something, then the tendency is to start checking your iPhone or checking your iPad or whatever it is and just turn off. We're bored. If you look at, there's a research indicating that the lengths of pop songs have gone down over the years. Pop songs have themselves become more simplistic and more sort of based around base emotions. Boom, boom, boom. That was a bit of a boomer tech there. Which I think Dr. Harvey, God rest his soul, would appreciate. Anyway, so what's happening here? You know, the argument is that we've basically become we can't deal anymore with boredom. We want to be stimulated all the time. Now, this was commented upon, notes Mann in the book, back in 1845. Hoffmann, the German writer, had a character by the name of Fidgety Phil. And since you know, the 1980s or 1970s, there has just been this proliferation of diagnoses with ADHD and related disorders. In 2005 already, 82% of American psychologists interviewed felt that the condition was overdiagnosed. Up to 2013, there had been in 24 years before that, there had been 600,000 cases of ADHD diagnosed in the USA. Over the preceding quarter of a century, it went to 3.5 million by 2013. So this is a massive rise in the diagnosis of ADHD. And what Mann argues is that we are basically medicalising boredom, that we can no longer cope with being bored, that we're more prone to being bored, and that therefore this kind of behaviour, A, didn't used to be a problem, and B, the nature of society itself has made us less able to cope with boredom. And he looks at research which indicates that TV viewing, lots and lots of advertising, all this kind of thing, this constant bright lights, all this constant stimulation has led to a situation where people become increasingly desensitized to stimulation, rather like how a person who drinks alcohol can then needs more and more alcohol to get the same effect. We become increasingly desensitized to stimulation, and so we need more and more and more stimulation. And if we don't get that stimulation, then we very easily become bored. And because we become bored, we play up essentially. We can't concentrate. We can't get on. We can't sit down and keep still. We can't be attentive because we just can't cope with this lack of stimulation. In a sense, we've become more extroverted, and indeed there is some evidence that ADHD symptoms cross over with extraversion. What extraversion involves is the need for external stimulation and getting a massive rush out of external stimulation. And he looks at evidence indicating that it is hardwired into us, that people who have ADHD have fewer receptors in the brain which allow them to become stimulated than do people who don't have it. And so consequently, they become bored more easily. Now, this is a very, very interesting phenomenon, and although there could be a genetic element to it, in the sense that, as I've discussed in other videos, we run a Darwinian selection, heavy Darwinian selection until 1800, 40% child mortality. Now it's down to 1%, and this would have led to a proliferation of mutations which wouldn't otherwise have survived under Darwinian conditions. You're going to get mutations, people that would have died out would have been people with poor immune systems, so you're going to get all kinds of physical mutations proliferating and thus becoming more and more physically ill. But the brain is 88% of the genome. It's a massive target for mutations. So as you get more physical mutations, you're going to get more and more mental mutations, which would otherwise have been wiped out due to their correlation with physical mutations, building up in the society, and consequently more autism and perhaps more ADHD as well. Now, this may be possibly an explanation for the rise, but it can't be completely the explanation because, of course, the rise is so quick. It's far too fast for it to be solely a matter of genetics. It must be something to do with the environment, and as good an idea as any is this overstimulation that we experience. And if you think about, when I was a child, there was a TV now if I take my children somewhere in the car, they have their iPads and they're stimulated the whole time and they're fine and they behave. When I was a boy, there was a TV program called Why Don't You, which was made in Northern Ireland, and it would say things like, if you're going in a car on a long journey, then get a piece of paper and put a pen on the piece of paper and it'll move every time you go over a bump in the road, and by the end of the journey you'll have a work of art. That was the level of boredom we had to experience in the 1980s, that we had to do things like that. We had to watch programs like Why Don't You about Northern Irish people telling us how to deal with boredom, because a lot of life was boredom. Now this is not computer games or anything. Now this is not the case. Now, in this book, the the science of boredom argues that the opposite can be seen in terms of autism, and autistic is the opposite in many respects of a person who has ADHD. The autistic is an introvert. This is characterised by being unable to read emotions, being unable to express emotions, being able to quite understand other people because you take things very literally or whatever, and to a certain degree being unnaturally able to deal with boredom. To the extent that you bore other people. There is an obsessive dimension to people that have to people that have autism spectrum disorder, ASD. When they're diagnosed, there's a checklist of criteria, but one of them is that you, like Greta Thunberg, that you're obsessed with certain things. And you go on and on about them, and you don't really understand that other people are bored of what you're saying. It is very difficult to make you bored. You don't need lots of stimulation. You just need, if anything, you get overstimulated very easily. You're hypersensitive to noise, hypersensitive to change, and you're hypersensitive to anything around you. Overstimulation, not understimulation. Overstimulation is the problem, and these kinds of people can be perfectly content doing a job, doing something which a lot of people would find very boring, writing, academia, this sort of thing, because they don't get overstimulated very easily. They can concentrate incredibly well, and they become absolutely obsessed with things and want to know everything about them, and they're not particularly interested in people and dealing with people or anything like that. They're interested in systems and understanding logically and coherently how things work, to an extent that it's moderately antisocial. Now, equally, there's a massive rise in diagnoses of autism. It's gone from 1 in 1,000 of the population in the 1970s to 11 in 1,000 today that are diagnosed with this. And the person that's done a lot of research on it, Simon Baron-Cohen, is coming to the conclusion it's a problem, this, because it's so overdiagnosed, and because it means that people want to, there's this checklist, and you have bits of the checklist and not other bits of the checklist, so you have some people that don't have the obsessive dimension of autism, but they have other dimensions of autism, and so they have them to a great extent, and so they end up being diagnosed as autistic. And one criticism of both ADHD and autism is that there's a degree to which it is noticed at school because the children are, of course, playing up. The ADHD children are playing up because they won't sit down and they fidget and they jump around all over the place and whatever, and they can't concentrate. And the autistic children will play up because they'll be mean to other children because they have no social skills. They'll get into fights with other children. They'll get overstimulated easily and go mad and be disruptive in the classroom. And so parents would, rather than accept that their child is just badly behaved and needs to be dealt with along those lines, it's much more fashionable and much more pleasant to be able to say, oh, my child has a disorder. My child is disabled. Because in the current woke world, in the current year, as it were, this means they're important, they're special, they're interesting. In Finland, if your child has autism or any such mental disability, you get a card which allows you to go in free with them to anything in the country that they might want to go to. Because they need a carer all the time, and it would be discrimination for them not to have this carer, and so you shouldn't have to pay. I mean, it's fantastic. So, EU-wide card. So this is one of the problems with it. So I was contacted in this regard, and it was this gentleman that drew my attention to the book, The Science of Autism, by a patron and a viewer of mine called Mr. Oliver Rayner Hills, who some of you may well be familiar with. And I'm very glad that he drew my attention to this. It's a very interesting area. It's the second time, actually, that he has kindly drawn my attention to something extremely interesting. The first was some research on Unwin, J.D. Unwin's research. And what he suggested was that this might be in line with my colleague Michael Woodley's social epistasis amplification model. He argues that these children are basically bored, and that because the social amplification, epistasis amplification model, as you may know, argues that since the Industrial Revolution, there's been this rise in these spiteful mutations of the mind, which would have been purged under Darwinian conditions due to the high mortality rate, because they would have been comorbid with mutations of the body, and those would have meant you didn't survive into adulthood. Now that the mortality rate for children has fallen from 40% to 1%, it means you have a rise in these spiteful mutants advocating these ideas, which would have got you destroyed under Darwinian conditions at the individual level, and indeed at the level of the group, such as multiculturalism, that you help ethnic groups other than your own, such as feminism, that women delay their fertility, they don't really have any children, or don't have many children, such as assorted other, spiteful sort of left-wing ideas. And so and they undermine things which have been adaptive. So one thing that could be regarded as adaptive is religiousness. Religiousness is adaptive because it tends to elevate ethnocentrism. It takes adaptive ideas such as that you should pass on your genes or you should fight off the outsider or whatever, and it makes those the will of God. So of course then with atheism and whatever, it undermines this group selected thing, religiousness, and it makes people less adaptive. And a good example of this can be seen in the way that women used to be more conservative than men, in that sense more adaptive, because a lot of religiousness correlates with fertility, it correlates with mental health, it correlates with physical health. It can be seen as an adaptive thing, an evolved trait. As I've looked at in other videos, women are now, although they're still more religious, they are more left-wing than men. And because they're more left-wing than men, the religiousness which made women more religious than men, and so once religiousness is undermined, then this thing which made them, because they're more religious, more conservative, once that's undermined, their natural propensity towards empathy and being cooperative and whatever comes through, and they become more left-wing, more likely to adopt feminism, more likely to ruin their genetic interests and put off having children for too long, this kind of thing. And so it's damaging their interests, because religiousness, their genetic interests, because religiousness has been undermined. Now, in the same way, it could be argued that these spiteful mutants have got into these positions of power, and they've advocated various things, such as the destruction of the normal system of education, which had been developed up to that point. And another thing that's happened, of course, is that because everyone has become less able to deal with boredom, and prone to being overstimulated and also just less intelligent, as we've looked at elsewhere, it means that certain people in the classroom are understimulated. By basically bad teaching, they get bored and they play up. So ultimately, this could be regarded as a matter of an expression of the social epistasis model. The things which would have caused them to behave themselves, shall we say, mean that are gone, and so therefore they play up because they get bored easily. Now, I think that Mr. Rainer Hills may have quite a good point on that, although I'd like to sort of narrow it down, really. It strikes me that we have a traditional system of education which was in place and which was underpinned by religious diktats of how children should be treated and of how people should behave, and that it is this that has been attacked. And we know from Wilson and Herrnstein's research that the way that has the best outcomes in terms of creating well-behaved children who outwardly conform, and also children who are inwardly content, children that are psychologically adapted, appears to be parenting that is harsh yet loving, such that when the child behaves well, and just in general, the parents are loving and kind, but that when the child breaks the rules, there is a harsh reaction, there is punishment. Traditionally, of course, this has been corporal punishment. Now, any other combination, harsh yet cold, leads to a bad reaction. Harsh, loving and lax leads to maladaptive behaviour. It's harsh yet loving. Now, this can be seen to be transferred over into the schools by teachers like Dr. Harvey, who was, as it were, harsh yet loving. He was a very reasonable, kind man, and it was quite clear that he had our interests at heart, and there was structure, and there was rules, and so on. Well, he didn't actually beat us, but you'd have that rigmarole, which was enough to the threat was, although it would have been illegal, but even so, the threat was definitely sufficient. Harsh yet loving, and certainly there were things when I was at infant school. And indeed junior school, not secondary school. And so there was this fear element in the education system. Now, it strikes me that what this meant was that children who might get bored easily, children who, and therefore play up, had a very strong incentive not to play up. Because the teachers were an authority figure, the teachers had power, the teachers could hit them, or certainly they could physically punish them, make them stand up for ages, shout at them, whatever it was. And so, consequently, there was a strong incentive to suppress these feelings, and to outwardly conform. And later on, of course, you'd find, as if you were too clever for that situation, that you'd get the level of stimulation that you wanted, at least if you had good teachers. But certainly, so you're not going to like every subject, and certainly in a subject that you didn't like, there was this strong incentive to behave yourself. Now, this has gone with the takeover of the education system by women, and therefore much more in the way of being, loving and not harsh at all. Everything based around sort of empathy and the viewpoint of the child, and let's sit down and talk about this, and let's put them in time out, and let's everyone try and be friends, and no shouting, that might emotionally damage the child. All this empathy, it means that for people like this, there is basically no incentive to behave themselves, and so they don't. And so it strikes me that that's what you're seeing with, in part, this rise in ADHD, is simply children who are badly taught. And this leaks into the homes in the sense that parents are told that now, in my generation, that this is the way you should treat your children, and if you so much as look at them in an angry way, then that's tantamount to child abuse. And so consequently, at an environmental level, you create these people who are subject to loving and lax, which creates bad outcomes in terms of behaviour and psychological adaptation, and which means that people are not used to dealing with adversity, which makes it more difficult for them to deal with adversity later on, as I discussed in another video on depression. And so you have the rise in ADHD. Now, Mr. Rayner Hills suggests that it also, there's a sense in which society lowers the bar. So society creates a situation in which these children will become more bored more easily, possibly because of overstimulation, or possibly because you have to appeal to the lowest common denominator. And this means keeping things, who are all overstimulated, which means keeping things very, very simple and so on, so that these people misbehave, and this means that the more intelligent ones then become bored and play up, which would actually fit with the idea of this as a middle-class diagnosis. It strikes me he may be right about that. That may well fit as well, that if you make the situation too simple and therefore too boring for slightly more intelligent children, and so they may become ADHD as a result, and there'll be nothing to force them to behave. So at both levels, and you could argue that this overstimulation and all this that is happening is a result of the breakdown in normal structures. It's a result of a commercial society in which everything is about enjoyment and everything is about hedonism, and which could itself be regarded as I've looked at in other videos, as something that's maladaptive, because it is not the hedonistic society that survives in terms of group selection. It's the society which seems to be highly religious and which strongly believes in its own eternal importance, to the extent that it suppresses emotions. And J.D. Unwin has looked at this. It suppresses emotions and suppresses sexual drives and suppresses, keeps itself under a tight leash. And this seems to correlate in the society becoming more creative and more cooperative and getting on better, and therefore more ethnocentric, cooperating together, and more negatively ethnocentric as well. So all of this rise in ADHD can be ultimately reduced to ideologies of hedonism, of atheism, of child-centeredness, of human rights, of rights of the individual over the group, of atheism, meaning that you no longer take religious diktats and treat children and people in certain harsh yet loving ways, and therefore you don't do so as much anymore, because there's no tradition dictating to you to be cruel, to be kind. There's no tradition dictating to you to overcome your natural love, to do something that might be good for the child in the future, whether it's through corporal punishment or through some other form of punishment that it might make it that they might not like, such as making it stand up, hands on heads, or whatever else we had at school. So all of this would fit with the model and would help to explain this rise in ADHD. These people are bored because society has overstimulated all of us, which means that we go onto our iPads really quickly and we go onto our phones really quickly and so on. But also the normal structures which would have kept us, or allowed us to cope with being bored, and to cope with these situations, have education to suppress our emotions, which we feel when we're bored, have broken down. Now, the second thing that Mr. Rayner Hills asked me about was the issue of autism. We have, of course, more people who are autistic, and he suggests that this is a problem because it means that you have more autistics, and those autistics will be focused towards the hard sciences. The sciences will become more autistic and mechanized. There will be an increasing disconnect between the hard and the soft sciences. They won't kind of get each other, and therefore this would help to explain why the two kinds of science have diverged and moved away from each other, with one ever more empirical and one ever more just nonsense, just ideology and not understanding the other, based around emotion and empathy and so on. I'm not sure I agree with that, because you would think that if there is a norm that we would have had under conditions of Darwinian selection, then you'd expect a movement perhaps in both directions. So you'd expect a movement towards autism on the one hand and towards sort of schizophrenia really on the other. So there'd be the opposite of autism is over-mentalizing, and this leads you to become paranoid. It leads you to see agency behind everything, and this seems to be the essence of the left. Everything's reducible to agency, even science. Everything's reducible to power. I think I'd go further than that, but also I'm not quite sure it's the that's what's happened in practice. Of course, what's happened in practice is you've simply seen the sciences become bureaucratized. They've been overwhelmed with females, including in the hard sciences, because females are higher in conscientiousness and agreeableness than men, and this predicts getting on in the world of science, and so consequently these high-functioning autistics are basically driven out of science, and science simply becomes less scientific and is dragged into the mire of social science, where everything's based around ideology and feelings, and solving problems might offend people, and so you shouldn't do it. So I'm not 100% sure I agree with that, although it's a very good point. But in conclusion, the rise of ADHD, I would agree, it is overdiagnosed. What we're really talking about here is people who are bored. Why are they bored? They're bored because they're overstimulated, which means that they're used to overstimulation, which means they need more stimulation, which means they become bored easily. We become bored more easily than we used to. But then, to make matters worse, the structures which were in place to compel us to suppress the antisocial behaviour which tends to result from being bored have been taken away, undermined by the ideologies espoused by spiteful mutants such as atheism and feminism and human rights and lack of group consciousness and all this other kind of stuff that's ultimately very damaging, because it's the group that's highly internally cooperative and externally hostile that survives in terms of group selection. And so what this means it is a further problem, elevating ADHD and leading it to be out of control, which then creates bad schooling and a society of people who have no emotion, who are just emotionally incontinent and who think they're the centre of the universe because they have not been raised in a situation that is harsh yet loving. And for those of you that are going to write to me and say this is a terrible problem, oh, haven't you seen the research indicating how bad it is to so much as frown at a child? If you look at the research, it's very interesting actually. There's a paper, I shall put it below the video, by Ellison and his colleague, which found that corporal punishment of children has negative life outcomes, except among Christian fundamentalist pupils, where it seems to have, or young people, where it seems to have positive life outcomes, as long as it's done in a context that is harsh yet loving and in a structured way and not done in anger. And then it has positive outcomes for these fundamentalist Christians. In addition, there was research which found that it has positive outcomes for black people in America. And that most of the research on this was hopelessly genetically confounded, because of course people who are psychologically unstable are more likely to hit their kids, and those kids will be psychologically unstable, but it's not because they've been hit, it's just because they've inherited being psychologically unstable. And when you control for genetic confounds, then these negative outcomes apparently disappear. And it seems that although it's not always it's overall positive, it's certainly not negative. And among these fundamentalist Christians, who we might expect, as we've looked at in other videos, to be highly adapted because we're selected to be religious. So as I've seen in other videos, religious people have a low mutational load. They tend to be low in mental instability. They tend to be, as it were, a remnant normal population that would have fusionate mutations based on the research I've done. And those people respond positively to corporal punishment and traditional means of upbringing. Very interesting, isn't it? So, anyway, I hope this has been of interest, and I hope that it's been pleasing to Mr. Oliver Rayner Hills, Esquire, and I was very pleased. Thank you very much, for him contacting me, and I hope this has been okay. If you've enjoyed this, then please subscribe. It really helps if you subscribe. Drop me a few shillings on Patreon or on Subscribestar or on PayPal if you're really, really nice. And if you'd like to see me live, I shall be speaking at the the Traditional Britain Movement, Traditional Britain Group Conference in London on the 19th of October, I think it is, or do check. And if you're in Norway, then I shall be speaking on the 2nd of November in Oslo at the Skansa Forum, so perhaps you'd like to join me there. And until then, please get in touch if you have any ideas, and I hope this has been of interest, and as ever, goodbye!